If you missed Bible study this morning, I think it was a good one. I got good positive feedback from those who were in attendance. And the reason that's so is because it helped us tie together Genesis chapter 11 and Genesis chapter 12. If you remember last week, I talked about how we're kind of at a pivot point, if you will, how the biblical narrative is going to change just a little bit as we move from Genesis 11 to Genesis 12. And we kind of explained the connection. Some people will be like, I don't understand how the Tower of Babel story that's in Genesis chapter 11, how does that connect to Abraham? How do those two narratives, those two stories go together? And we talked about that a little bit in our Bible study this morning. Now, basically what we're going to see is that through the first 11 chapters of Genesis, what's been happening is that God has been showing you the responses of mankind in general. What has happened through the first 11 chapters? For the most part, mankind has outright rejected God. He's tried to work with them. He's tried to reach out to them. He's tried to show him how he is the one true God, how he cares for them and wants to take care of them and wants to bless them. But time and time again, they reject him. They say, no, we're not going to serve you. If you remember, it happened in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve chose to eat from the tree when they were told not to, correct? Genesis chapter 4, we see that Cain will not listen to God and he murders his brother anyways. Genesis chapter 6 is the next one we come to. And what does the Bible say? It says that the earth became so violent and so opposed to God that God said the entire earth was ruined in his sight. Only one family out of all that were on the face of the planet chose to be loyal to God. And then in Genesis chapter 11, the one we just ended, we see it again. The people rebel, they oppose God, they say that we're going to build a tower that reaches up into the heavens itself, that they're going to overthrow heaven. And so time and time again, we see mankind reject God on a large basis. But in Genesis chapter 12, what we're going to see happen is that God is now going to show us an example of somebody who is loyal to God, somebody who chooses God, somebody who does what God asks for them to do. And so it's a little bit of a contrast by comparison. Here's what the rest of the world looks like. Here's what the nations look like. But here's one man whose name is Abram, and that's what we read about him in Genesis chapter 12 at the moment. Here's one man that God calls, and he's going to be one that shows us what righteousness, what loyalty, what obedience looks like. Now, what's really interesting about Abraham's story, though, is that we're really going to be able to see the gospel come to light in Abraham's story. Remember what Paul said. This is a verse I've shared with you before in Galatians chapter 3, verse 8. What Paul says there is that God shared the gospel with Abraham beforehand. What does he mean by beforehand? Well, before Jesus comes to earth, before the revelation of the Christ, right? But everything that God is doing with Abraham actually helps us understand what the gospel is about. It's that we see the example of what the gospel is through the life of Abraham, through the life of Abraham. Everything from Abraham's call out of Mesopotamia, which we'll talk about, Abraham's faithfulness of listening to God and doing what he says. Even think about how Abraham later on, we'll read about this, is called to offer up his only son. All of that points us forward to the gospel. That's how we began to see who God is and what he's going to do for us by what he does through Abraham. But what we're going to see today in Genesis chapter 12 is that as God begins to call Abraham, Abraham's at a crossroads. And that's kind of the name of our sermon, the crossroads. He has a decision that he has to make. God is going to ask him to do something, and what is Abraham going to do? Is this an easy decision, a hard decision? Which decision will Abraham make? And as we go through it today, we're going to kind of break down Abraham's story in chapter 12. We're going to decompose it, if you will, and we're going to see that it has a great application for us today. Just like Abraham was at a crossroads, he had to make a decision. Each one of us, at times in our life, are at a crossroads as well. We must decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to obey God's call? Or are we going to pursue what we want to pursue, our own life, our own identity, our own desires and goals? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So if you open up your Bibles, Genesis chapter 12 is where we're going to begin. And let's just start with the first 3 verses of Genesis 12. Let's notice what it is that God says to Abraham. I guess I should call him Abram at this point, since that's what the Bible, he has not yet been renamed by God. So Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Here's what it says. Now the Lord said to Abram, go. Simple word, go. He told him to leave. Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing, like I shared with the kids, a blessing to others. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So that's what God says to Abraham. A few simple verses, not a lot of detail there. He just simply tells Abram to leave, to go from the land in which he spent his entire life. Remember, at this point, Abram's about 75 years old, somewhere in that neighborhood. It's actually, I think the Bible tells us specifically that he was 75 years old. And God tells him to pack up and leave. Now think about that command for just a moment. How hard do you think that would be? I know there are several of you in here that are close to Abraham's age. What if we told you you have to leave? You have to travel from far away and go to a land in which you do not know. How easy of a decision do you think that would be? And can you see the crossroads that Abraham is at? The decision that he has to make. Do I listen? Or do I stay where I'm at with what I'm comfortable with everything that I know? And that's the crossroads that Abraham is at. Now, if you notice, there's three things that he's told to leave behind. He's told to leave behind his land, his name. It says to leave his family. That's what it's talking about. It is the name that Abraham had in the city where he grew up with. And as we'll see later on as we keep talking, he's told to leave the gods that have been worshipped in the land in which he was at that time. Now, as you think about those three things, those are actually three important aspects to any person living at the time of Abraham: name, land, and God. Now, for those of you in the tent class, or those of you who have been joining, if Dr. Richter hasn't gotten to it yet, she will. But those are three very important aspects of someone who was alive during that time. That's where they got their entire identity from, was their name, their land, and their God. That's how they identified who they were as a person, who they were known to be. Everything about them came from those three qualities. Think about it for a moment. The name. That name tells everybody what family you come from, what reputation you had, what you were known for in the place in which you lived. But think about what Abram's about to do. He's about to leave a land that's familiar with his name and go to a land where nobody knows who Abram is. He's never been heard of before. His name means nothing in the land of Canaan where he's about to go. Think about the land itself. Land is what represented sustenance and security in the ancient Near East, as we called it. Without land, you had nothing. Without land, you were destitute. Without a place to raise your flocks or grow your vineyards or whatever it was, you were poor. That's what it looked like in Abraham's day. So God is asking him to leave behind his name and the one thing that made him secure in his time, the land, the only thing of value, of property that he had. Does that make sense? And then obviously I mentioned about God. If you knew nothing about me, if you knew nothing about my name, nothing about where I came from, the land that I came from, but I told you who my God was. Like back in their day, if I said I worship the god Baal, or Baal as we call him, that would reveal to you a lot about me. It would tell you where I was from, because that is a god of a specific region. It would tell you what I believed and the kind of things that I practiced and worshiped and things of that nature. God is telling him to leave all of that behind and to go. His very identity, the very thing that made Abram who he was, God is saying to leave it behind and go to a new place. Now, does that message sound familiar? Have you heard that anywhere else in the scriptures before? Can you think of anywhere else in the Bible where we're told to leave behind our old identities and to follow somebody else, to go somewhere else? That's the message of the gospel. And we'll talk about how Genesis and the gospel ties together in just a moment. But if we understand how those three things affected a person, how their identity came from those three items that I mentioned, that helps us understand a little bit better what's happening in this narrative with Abraham. Think about this for a moment. God calls Abraham to go, but at this time, at this point in verses 1 through 3, he gives Abraham no promises. There's no covenant that's been established at this time. There's no direction. There's no explanation. It's just one simple command: to leave. Leave behind everything that he identifies with. Can you see the radical trust that God is asking him to do? To give up everything that the man knows and to go to a land where he has nothing. That helps us to understand why it is that God promises what he does to Abraham. if you read through those verses again, notice the three things that he says that he will do for Abraham. He says that he's going to give him a land, right? He's going to make his name great. And as we read on, eventually what we're going to see is that God does make a covenant with Abraham where he says, if you will serve me, I will be your God and you will be my people. Does that make sense? So God promises to eventually provide him with all three things that he's asking him to give up, to leave in the land of Ur, where he was leaving from. And that's the same thing that God asks us to do today. We don't find our identity in the world. We don't find our identity in the things that we have or the name that we currently hold. Our identity is found in God and his purpose that he has for us. Now, it's interesting, too, as we read these verses, if we look at the syntax of the Hebrew, the actual formation of the words, a better way of what to read what God is saying to Abraham is this. He's basically saying to him, go forth so that I may bless you. And I think that's a powerful point for us. If we stay connected, if we stay attached to the things that God tells us to leave behind, it's going to be difficult for us to receive God's blessing. If there's something in the way, if there's something between us and God, if there's something distracting us that we've been asked to leave behind, it will be hard for us to receive God's full blessing and for us to be a blessing to others, like he says to Abraham. So it's a very important command whenever God tells Abram to leave where he was and to go somewhere new. Now, there's another interesting point that we want to consider as well. There's a map that I would like to show you, and on this map, there we go, it's a little small. I tried to make it as big as I could, but on this map, on the lower, what would that be? So on the lower right-hand side, I think you can see it a little better on this screen. You see where Ur is down there by that body of water on the lower left-hand side? That's where Abraham was living. That's where he had to leave from. And he travels up in a northwesterly direction to Haran, which is in the top left-hand corner of the map. And then he comes down into the Promised Land, down along the Mediterranean coast where you see all those cities from Israel's history. But that's the path that he had to go. Now, the region that he's leaving is called Mesopotamia. That's where he's called out of. But do you see that city that's right in the middle, that's kind of halfway in between Ur and Haran? Do you see what it says? It's the city of Babylon is what it says. Now, what do you all know about Babylon? Is this a good place, a bad place, dark place, light place, evil place? Well, we know that Babylon is associated with oppression. He's associated with rebellion. This is the city that came and conquers, the nation that came and conquers God's people later on in biblical history. What's interesting, though, is that in Genesis chapter 11, even though you don't recognize it, you just read about the city of Babylon. It's referred to as Babel in Genesis chapter 11. Those are one and the same cities. Babel becomes Babylon, the very place that oppresses God's people, that enslaves God's people, that resists God's people. So I think it's a very interesting point that whenever God calls Abraham out, he calls Abraham out of the very capital, the very central of the rebellion and the opposition against God. He tells Abraham, you cannot stay there. You cannot stay attached to the very place that opposes me and receive my blessing and be a blessing to others. So he calls Abraham out of the place where mankind is rebelling against the one true God. Now, what's interesting is that actually connects that story, that call for Abraham to leave Babylon, to leave Mesopotamia, to leave Ur. It connects us to the book of Revelation. We're going to begin to see how that's a theme all throughout the Bible, how God calls his people out of the place where they were and into a new place, into a new identity, into a spiritual paradise. Now, as we keep reading, God has now called Abraham out, and we see the implications of that call. We see that this wasn't a simple thing, that God was leaving, Abraham was leaving behind his very life, the very things that he identified with, and going to somewhere where he had nothing, no name, no land, no offspring, anything like that. But what is it that Abraham does? How does he respond? Let's read Genesis chapter 12, verse 4. It says this, God calls him, and verse 4 says, so Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. And Lot went with him, and Abraham was 75 years old when he departed for Haran. Do you notice the simple response that Abraham has? God gives a simple command. He tells him to go. He tells him to leave. And what is Abraham's response? He simply goes. He simply does what it is that God tells him to do. Compare that to what we saw in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. For example, compared to what does Adam and Eve do whenever God gives them a command? Well, they question it, they justify it, they rationalize it. They do everything that they can so that they can make their choice, what it is that they want to do, be the decision that they can make. But Abraham doesn't do that. On contrast, he just does exactly what God tells him to do. And so here's an important point that we want to remember. Faith acts. Faith does what it's told to do, but sin rationalizes. Sin and pride and these other emotions that we have, it rationalizes. It causes us to ask, why do I need to do that? Why can't I do what I want to do? That's the story of Genesis 1 through 11, but now we see someone looking at the commands a different way. Faith acts, sin rationalizes. And that's something that we want to remember. So as we think about our day today, I think there's a lot of rationalization that goes on inside of Christianity, right? God asks us to do things. He tells us to leave behind certain practices, certain identities, things that we may cling to that we're comfortable with. What do? Do we obey like Abraham did? Do we simply leave behind those old ways of life, those old thoughts, those ideas, those practices? Or do we try to rationalize why it's okay? Why it's okay to remain the person we were, to do the things that we were doing, to believe the things that we were believing. That's very easy for us to do, to look at our old life, the things that we're comfortable with, the things that we identify with, and to try to rationalize why we do not need to do what God has called us to do. But that's not the example that Abraham gives us. He simply obeyed because God said so. Simple explanation is that. Now, we talked about how this begins to show us the gospel, that the gospel begins to shine through as we look at Abraham's example. Notice something that Jesus said to us. Turn over to the book of Luke, chapter 14, verse 33. And I think it's actually, the verse up on the screen will be from the NIV. It's a little bit better rendering. So this is from the NASB, but it says, "So then none of you can be my disciples who does not give up all his own possessions." If I remember correctly, the NIV puts it, you cannot be my disciple if you don't leave behind everything, is what the NIV says. Everything. That's exactly what God told Abraham to do. Leave behind everything. Your name, your land, your family, all of it. In order to be my disciple, you must be ready to walk away from anything that holds you back, from anything that distracts you from God, from anything that separates you from the purpose that he has for you. Jesus calls us to leave behind ourself, our security, and our identity, and to make a new life in him, to leave behind and to be his disciple. That's exactly what we see in Abraham's example. And so what will you do? Will you respond as he did with a simple, "Yes, Lord, here I am," and go where he tells us to go? Or will we try to justify that we have to remain the same? There's another tie to the New Testament as well. I talked about the city of Babylon. If you turn over to Revelation chapter 18, verses 2, it talks about Babylon in the book of Revelation. And in verse 2, it starts to tell us that this angel is speaking about Babylon, and it says, "Babylon has fallen." But notice what it says. It says that Babylon has become the dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. Weird words, but what basically is the angel telling John through that vision? That the opposition, that the resistance still is happening today. Most of mankind is still in outright opposition to the Lord. And it refers to that state, if you will, in Revelation as being in Babylon, the same place that Abraham was called out of. We can't remain in opposition to God. We have to leave a world that opposes God and come to a new place. And that's even what he goes on to say. Revelation 18, verse 4. It says this, "I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people. Come out of Babylon, so that you shall not participate in her sins and receive her plagues.'" So the call is the same. The call is the same as Abraham. We cannot stay in our old lives. We cannot cling to our old identities. Whatever it is that we are clinging to, whatever system, whatever value, whatever ideology, whatever pursuit, if it is in opposition to God, if it is in conflict with God, if it separates us from a holy God, We are called to leave it behind, just like Abram was. We can't have both worlds. We have to do one or the other. So do you see how the Abraham narrative is beginning to foreshadow the gospel? It's like a drama, if you will, playing out in Abraham's life. He is going to ask Abraham to do things, culminating in the offering, the sacrifice of his only son. And all of this is going to point us forward to the message and the actions that Jesus Christ will do once we get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It is a drama that's playing out, that's teaching us about the gospel. So, as we're reading through these verses, as we keep considering the details, ask yourself that question. What's this teaching me? What's this preparing me for? How is this pointing me forward to Christ and the kind of response that I need to have as Christ calls us into a life that follows him? So what gives you your identity today? Is it your family? Is it your career? Is it your reputation? Maybe it's your possession, the material things that we have, cars, houses, whatever it may be. But perhaps it's the culture, the idea, the ideologies, the beliefs that are common in our time and our land. What do you identify with? Well, what God is doing is calling us to leave behind those identities and to find our new identity in him. To be a disciple of Christ, we have to disown ourselves and to pick up our stake and follow Christ daily, is what the scriptures tell us. It's a daily act of disowning ourselves and pursuing what God does for us. Are we willing to trust God like Abraham did with both our past and our future? Or are we stuck? Are we clinging to the identities that will separate us from God? The call is not to understand everything. Many times God will call us into something that maybe we can feel the call, we can see the call, we can discern it, but we don't know exactly where is it leading. How are you going to take care of me? How will I provide for my family? What will I do if I have to find a new job or a new place to live? But our call is not to understand. Our call is just to obey and trust that God has our best interests in hand. And can you leave behind what he's asked you to do? Like Abraham, God calls us to leave behind every false source of identity and security. There's a Christian band out there called Audio Adrenaline. They've got a good song that I like, and some of the lyrics of the chorus of that song say this: in order to win your life, you must come in last place. To live your life, you must lose it, but then it says this: all the losers get a crown. And I think that's a good message. That's a good message that it says. Success, identity, we don't see that the same way that the world does. We have to lose our lives in order to gain it. And if we trust God, if we follow him, he will give us a crown at the end of the day. So blessing does not come from what we hold on to. Blessing comes from whom we follow, whom we listen to, and whom we connect ourselves with. Father, we thank you for the messages that you give us. We thank you for the example of Abraham to see what does loyalty look like. We have seen an example of opposition. Now we see an example of loyalty. So help us to be like Abraham, to consider his example with an open heart, with an open mind, with